Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to St. John's College. It's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who I've realized joins us from Liverpool, and before that from Virginia, from North Carolina, from New Jersey, and from London. So I'm going to offer you the claim that you've come the furthest. My name is Sarah Knott. I'm the most recently joined historian here at St. John's. And I realized in talking to Dr. Fryar this afternoon that we have a similar approach to history in that we both think about this place, that is to say Britain, in relation to another place, in my case in North America, and in her case, the Caribbean. So Christienna Fryar is a writer and an independent historian. At Goldsmiths, University of London, she launched and convened the UK's first MA in Black History. She's a trustee of the Black Cultural Archive and the Tudor Trust. She's also a member of that group which advises the Church of England on how to respond to its links to African slavery. She's the kind of historian, that is, who helps us live better and more ethically. She helps us think about the present day as well as about the past. One part of that process is for institutions to think about their own historic role as beneficiaries of enslaved labour. And another part of that process is to decolonise how we think. So Dr. Fryar is among those historians who really help us understand about empire, about power, about political contest in ways that really far exceed what we were taught in school. As she explains, here in the UK, the history of the British Empire is mostly treated as a separate category to modern British history, to the great loss of that modern British history. One consequence is that we can mistakenly think that race is not a category, not a part of this island's story. So one way that Dr. Fryar does her work is to head to the British National Archives and to explore the files of the Colonial Office. One of my favourite pieces of her writing explores the file, right? That is to say, the most dull kind of category of paperwork. And in that essay that I'm thinking of, she explains to us why the bureaucratic file is dry, why it's mundane, and she also shows us how we can go to those kinds of archives to find scandals, find texture that in fact enable us to see the ordinary lives of Jamaican free people, for example. So I know we're in for a real treat this evening. Dr. Fryar is currently writing a book entitled Entangled Lands, A Caribbean History of Britain, which we can look for in Blackwell's next year, published by Penguin Press. The title of her lecture today is Fears of Jim Crow, Jamaica at the Dawn of the American Century. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fryar.
Thank you all so much for being here, especially for being here on Halloween. I seem to be collecting the habit of giving lectures at Oxford on Halloween. This is the second straight October 31st that I've been here. But thank you all again for being here and for listening to this talk. And as Sarah mentioned, I work on a number of projects. This particular lecture is drawing from an older project, a monograph that I've been working on. But it is sort of a connected project, a kind of cumulative project to the one that Sarah just mentioned, Entangled Lands. So I hope we can engage at a number of levels with this particular material. At some point in the fall of 1959, Mrs. Melba Croswell wrote an essay she titled My Memories of Life in Jamaica 50 Years Ago, which she submitted to the Jamaican Memories Essay Contest held by the island's leading newspaper, the Daily Gleaner. The Gleaner had called for Jamaicans over the age of 60 to send their memories of life in Jamaica 50 years or so ago for the chance to win a cash prize. As the advertisement informed contestants, all entries were deposited in the Jamaica archives, which is where they still are today. Like several contestants, Melba Croswell recalled the Great Earthquake of January 14th, 1907. This was a catastrophe that George Blagrove called the Great Disaster. Mrs. Sarah E. Carter called it the Horrible Earthquake. Mrs. Adina McPherson, the Great Disaster of 1907. And G.A.E. Smith called it the Great Earthquake. These are all people who wrote into that competition. For 77-year-old Joseph D'Souza, it was, quote, the greatest disaster in my time. At 3:30 p.m. on January 14, 1907, a 6.5 magnitude earthquake ripped through Jamaica and shattered the capital city of Kingston. The death toll and damage were catastrophic. Approximately 1,000 people died. The city's infrastructure was shattered, as was virtually every building in the city. There were subsequent tremors that sparked a fire that whipped through the city hours later, felling any buildings in the downtown business district that had withstood the initial shocks. Melba Croswell recalled, "The fire that night was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen in my life. The rum stores and the hardware stores with paints, oils, dynamite, and detonators exploding every few minutes with pyrotechnical displays that were worth seeing." After the ground settled, displaced people ran through the city with little idea of where to go. "It is no exaggeration," wrote an observer, "to say that some persons had immediately lost their reason. They were rushing to and fro like wild beings." While the fire ravaged downtown Kingston, those who had lost their homes in other sections of Kingston fled to the city's racecourse and parade grounds. A local circus had set up on the racecourse before the earthquake, and the loud roar of lions added to the sense of chaos and probably fear. "People started to shout that the lions got loose and everyone ran away," Croswell wrote. Still, many people who lost their homes camped on that racecourse and parade ground for weeks. As though the devastation wasn't enough, there was a drama of an entirely different nature that was running parallel to the relief, rescue, and recovery efforts. Jamaica's governor, Sir James Alexander Swettenham, rejected the medical aid and military manpower offered by the United States Navy. This act began a months-long debate over British sovereignty, the idea of U.S. annexation, the respective racial regimes of the United States and the British Empire, and ultimately Swettenham's fitness to govern. But this debate had even more significance. It was one of the last debates before World War I about the purpose of Jamaica within the British system and the nature of colonial rule there. And I would argue that at stake in these discussions were some of the still unresolved problems from emancipation in the late 1830s. In particular, the subsequent inquest, which involved weeks of increasingly rancorous communications between colonial officials and Swettenham, material that I have gone through at painstaking detail so that you do not have to. All of this focused on one central question. Should Swettenham have asserted British sovereignty over Jamaica so strongly at a moment when Britain increasingly relied on the U.S. to protect its Caribbean colonies? For some, this was simply a practical matter of geopolitical realities. For others, however, U.S. protection threatened the possibility of the U.S. annexation of Jamaica, and with it, the imposition of a Jim Crow-like race regime. So this evening, I'll discuss some of the debates over his actions, and I'm most interested in what colonial officials and colonial subjects said about the race regimes in the British Empire and in the United States and the way that they compared the two. At times, these comparisons presented British Jamaica, if not as a racial heaven, at least as a carefully managed, peaceful oasis that was far preferable to the racist hell of the Jim Crow South. These people identified Britain as supposedly the best protector of all colonial subjects at a moment of crisis. But I think there's something else to watch out for. They understood this comparison between the U.S. and Jamaica to be flattering and complementary to British imperialism. I don't think we should understand it that way. The incident between Swettenham and the U.S. Navy began soon after the earthquake, when the governor requested additional medical supplies from the British consul in Havana. In consultation with naval authorities, the American governor of Cuba sent Rear Admiral Charles Davis's flotilla to Jamaica. The first ship arrived with those medical supplies on the evening of January 16th, and its commander told Swettenham that Admiral Davis was on his way with 2 battleships. In addition to those supplies, the 3 ships also brought medical personnel and, crucially, troops to restore order. The next morning, Davis presented himself at the governor's mansion known as King's House and told Swettenham that he had sent 2 armed bands of Marines to the American consulate and to the Kingston Penitentiary. At the prison, a small mutiny had erupted when prisoners refused to be locked in their cells. During the earthquake, 2 inmates had died, and prisoners were rightly and obviously terrified of being trapped again, and those fears only grew as the aftershocks began. Davis's ship, the USS Indiana, docked near the penitentiary and landed an armed brigade of men who quickly restored order to the prison. And in case it is not clear, he did not ask permission to do this. Swetnam saw Davis's actions as a foreign invasion. He tolerated it temporarily, but after the Marines helped quell the prison mutiny, Swetnam asked the admiral to leave Jamaica the following day, and he assumed that his request was the end of the matter. But the next morning, 20 minutes before a planned farewell meeting with Davis, Swetnam received a letter that the admiral had written the night before. In it, Davis listed his men's accomplishments, hoping that the governor would allow him to do more of this work the next day. Davis said that he had, quote, landed working parties from both ships of war on the shore to aid in wreck and clearing the ruins in the streets and buildings, end quote. But above all, Davis had already, again without permission, tasked his men with policing Kingston. The thieves and the looters that some Marines had apprehended the previous day led him to suspect that, and this is another quote, the police surveillance of the city was not adequate to the protection of private property. This indictment of Kingston's police did not sway Swetnam or allay his fears about the nature of Davis's intervention. In fact, he challenged the idea that private property was at risk or that the police were especially deficient. After all, he argued, police in all cities were inadequate to the job, including those in New York. And he tested Davis's logic quite sarcastically by reminding the admiral of a recent case where thieves had broken into a New York millionaire's townhouse. Here, the New York police, had not protected the millionaire's property. Quote, but this fact could not have justified a British admiral in landing an armed party to assist the New York police, end quote. He once again asked the Americans to leave, although he was willing to let a small group of unarmed Marines guard the U.S. consulate. Other than that, he was clear. American help was not needed. It is no longer any question of humanity, he explained. All the dead died days ago, and the work of giving them burial is merely one of convenience. So after a final meeting between the two men, Davis left Jamaica on January 19th. During the late 19th century, Jamaican affairs had become increasingly entangled with U.S. interests, creating a complex situation in which Jamaican elites saw U.S. investment as possibly economically beneficial at the same time that the expansion of the U.S. threatened British sovereignty. In terms of economic investment, the investments of U.S. businessmen like Lorenzo Baker of Boston Fruit, which eventually became United Fruit, bolstered the Jamaican banana industry, although this was, as always, at the expense of smallholders. With Baker's investment in fruit came an interest in tourism. And this was something that the colonial governor in the 1890s, Henry Blake, he seized upon this interest in tourism. In 1891, Blake hosted the Jamaica International Exhibition, which was designed to show off Kingston, but also the island's modernization. The event sparked a wave of hotel building in Kingston and St. Andrew, the parish that surrounds Kingston, and it used government, the hotels that were built were using government funds, and of course these were to house the increasing number of visitors coming to see Jamaica. In ways that read well to outside observers, Jamaica's economic fortunes were beginning to turn around, so it seemed, even though the lives of the island's peasantry were not transforming for the better. And as all this happened, a new set of ideas or narratives about Jamaica began to emerge. Two things had doomed British Caribbean economies in the mid-19th century. And these two things that I will list are not actually to do with freed people's conduct, even though that was what was typically blamed. The first thing that had doomed those economies was the refusal of white British people to transform their thinking after emancipation. And the second was the ideological fervor in Britain for free trade. And so by the late 19th century, it was very fashionable for British commentators who were still fixated on sugar and who were still really drenched in a kind of post-emancipation disappointment to describe Jamaica as ruined and decayed. Yet by the time we get to the 1880s and the 1890s, there are some alternative narratives of Jamaica's fortunes. In a set of late 19th century travel narratives and other documents, writers highlighted the island's natural splendor. And what distinguished these texts from earlier travel narratives was the way that the writers found potential and opportunity in the island's wilderness. Previous writers had tended to see the lush wilderness with skepticism or concern. So rather than seeing it as opportunity or possibility, they saw it as a sign that the island itself could not be tamed. But by the time we get to the turn of the century, writers were really drawn to the land's abundance and what it might offer, even as they still held the grim racist consensus from the 1850s and 1860s about Black Jamaicans. This idea of natural abundance was central to a travel narrative called Buckraland, which was written by the American Alan Eric. Published in 1892, Eric recounted a short trip that he had taken with his wife, and his descriptions were more akin to modern tourism promotions than tales of gloom. He seems enchanted by Jamaica in the text, and this is a real tonal departure from the mid-century travelogues. And this starts very early on. As he narrates his ship's approach to the northern coast, he speaks in this really almost rapturous way about what he is seeing. Quote, "The mountains of Jamaica loomed up directly ahead, clothed with luxuriant verdure from foot to crest. Viewed from any point, Jamaica, in point of scenery and verdure, is surpassed by no island in the world." I mean, he's not wrong, but... Though preliminary, this passage was symptomatic. It included 4 words that, along with their variants, showed up repeatedly throughout the text: mountains, clothed, luxuriant, and verdure. In another passage, Eric described the vistas as terrace after terrace of mountains upon mountains, clothed with banana, palm, oranges, and lime trees. And to give you a sense again of just how rapturous he is, even vultures received a wondrous gloss. Great buzzards, or John crows, with great red heads and large beaks and wrinkled red necks sailed overhead. But they are most useful birds, feeding upon carrion and scraps, contributing to the health of this beautiful country. What Eric described was an island that was almost an unspoiled Eden, whose abundance was inherent, requiring virtually no help from the people that he described as, quote, indolent natives, end quote. And so in his telling, the work habits of Black Jamaicans did not matter because the sweet oranges all grow wild on the hillsides and everywhere. So travelogues like these were the corollaries of the photographic boosterism of the same period. So this is a period where, at this point, tourism in the Caribbean is not specifically tied to beaches as it currently is. And so tourism promoters in the late 19th century were using photography to shift the idea of the Caribbean away from this sort of post-emancipation gloom and towards these visions of the island that emphasized natural fertility. And these promoters were very careful to depict Jamaica as a, quote, tropical picturesque Garden of Eden. And there I'm quoting from the art historian Krista Thompson. And I recommend her book if you want to get a sense of how these images change over about a 50-year period. These were narratives of agricultural or pastoral potential in which the Black population was rendered almost incidental to the island's fortunes. Another really popular exploration of these ideas in Britain was James Anthony Froude's The English in the West Indies. And this text, for people who study this period, is very well known in particular for the racism that is really deeply embedded throughout the whole text. And that's more what it's known for than the way he is thinking about wealth extraction. But I think it is important to think about the new arguments that he is putting forward in this text. So while some people were recommending a kind of pulling back from the British Caribbean, Froude was horrified by that idea, and he wrote the English in the West Indies out of concern that Britain might abandon its responsibilities and give over the colonies, formally or otherwise, to the United States. He did not accept the idea that these were minor colonies, easily ignored or even handed over to another power. And in fact, he saw the issue of how the Caribbean colonies were handled as really determinative of the thriving of the entire system. For him, if the English refused to take proper care of the Caribbean colonies, other colonies would view the metropole as unreliable. And then from there, he imagined the sort of slow collapse of the British Empire. So these are ideas that are, of course, imperialistic, they're nationalistic, and he does not speak about Jamaica with quite the level of rapture as Eric. But he still includes these depictions of wild bounty. Above the line, the tropical vegetation was in all its glory. Ferns and plantains waving in the moist air, cedars, tamarinds, gum trees, orange trees, striking their roots among the clefts of the crags and hanging out over the abysses below them. Aloes flung up their tall spiral stems, flowering shrubs and creepers covered bank and slope with green and blue and white and yellow. So Froude used these descriptions to say that the island's destiny was no longer bound up in sugar, but in the land more broadly. And like Eric did in Buckerland, Froude was also suggesting that the island's potential was not reliant on the actions of Black Jamaicans. And he described them as unthrifty, wasteful, and destructive. So what these texts were trying to think about, or what I think they were thinking about, is what role could a colony that had previously been the most important in the British Empire, what role could it now play now that it was slumping to supposedly minor colony status? This was not a settled question in the late 1800s. And I think these texts also demonstrate the way that a range of commentators were trying to reimagine possibilities for Jamaica's future. Yet while some of these new takes on old post-emancipation debates were trying to capitalize on the economic opportunities that the U.S. had to offer, they were not taking into account the rapid geopolitical changes that made the United States such a threat. Less than a decade before the earthquake, the U.S. had come out of the Spanish-American War with new territorial holdings in both the Pacific and the Caribbean. U.S. forces occupied Cuba immediately, so much for its independence. And when U.S. troops left Cuba in 1902, the United States Congress forced the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution, which gave Cuba only limited control over its own affairs. Now, within the U.S., formal empire, by which I mean the formal acquisition of territories, was deeply unpopular, especially after years of guerrilla warfare with Filipino freedom fighters. Yet U.S. leaders developed other ways, and these other ways are, of course, also imperial, even if they didn't admit that at the time and still don't admit that. They developed other ways to insert themselves into the affairs of their regional neighbors. Occupation was one, dollar diplomacy was another, and this was a tactic in which banks loaned money to foreign governments in exchange for U.S. financial intervention. In 1904, the Dominican Republic became the first test case for this new model of U.S. intervention. So Britain's posture towards the United States had to change. And I should say this was already, by this point, nearly a century long development. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine had established two key principles. So the first was that European powers were not allowed to attempt to colonize parts of the Western Hemisphere, which made the Western Hemisphere the United States' sphere of influence. So that was point one. And then the second point was really strengthened by the end of the 19th century as Britain began to default to U.S. authority in the Western Hemisphere. In the 1890s, there was a border dispute between Venezuela and British Columbia, and Britain backed down in the face of U.S. intervention. In 1902, there was a debt crisis in Venezuela that drew a European military presence. And that led President Theodore Roosevelt to present what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904 that declared that the United States would now act as a proxy for European states in the event of any dispute with a nation in the Americas. So Europeans, including Britain, were no longer supposed to colonize in the Western Hemisphere, and they were also not supposed to adjudicate disputes. In 1907, Britain agreed to sole U.S. control over the Panama Canal. And then a few years later, the Royal Navy mostly withdrew from North and South America, in effect entrusting the safety of Britain's colonies in the Western Hemisphere to the U.S. Navy. So by January 1907, when Swetnam is deciding what he can do with this admiral, British observers in Britain and Jamaica were welcoming U.S. investment in the fruit industry at the same time that Britain itself was pulling back from the region. And I think that these trends are all converging in this moment, in this debate and controversy over Swetnam's response. The rise of the U.S. as an imperial power had implications for British sovereignty over Jamaica and also had implications for the island's racial climate, which itself was still a product of emancipation decades earlier. Right after Swetnam rejected the Marines' assistance, stunned commentators and Jamaican residents tried him in the press, turning their dismay at his handling of the U.S. Marines into broader criticisms of his performance as a governor. But in London, the Colonial Office bureaucrats, who were, of course, very distant and detached from the death, distress, and chaos, they initially supported Swetnam. They believed that he was in theory justified in turning away the American help because it had threatened to violate British sovereignty. Swetnam had understood his role as governor to come with the right and the responsibility to prevent foreign invasion. And he, again, in these lengthy sort of back and forth dispatches, he even began to compare his position after the earthquake to that of President Theodore Roosevelt, who had refused foreign assistance after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. For Swetnam, asserting British sovereignty was all the more important because he was quite suspicious about what Americans were doing in the Caribbean basin and what they might be trying to do by landing in Jamaica. He thought that some Jamaicans actually wanted the island to become American or Canadian, or at least to spark a rivalry between North America and the United Kingdom. As he wrote, "I believe my duty as governor was to do my utmost to maintain the present dependency of Jamaica on the United Kingdom." Given U.S. involvement elsewhere in the region, he was probably right to wonder about Davis's intent. And the Colonial Office shared his wariness of U.S. expansionism. In one set of internal minutes, an undersecretary referred to a previous statement from the Secretary of State for the Colonies, who had written about how he shared those views that it was quite undesirable to allow a foreign armed party into a British colony. Another undersecretary agreed, noting that the government's main problem wasn't with Swetnam's decision, but with his tone, that sarcasm, that aside about New York, that was more the problem than the decision. But again, the governor had fundamentally misunderstood the degree to which Britain now relied on the United States as a caretaker of British territories in the Caribbean. This caretaker arrangement, which was fragile, came with a lot of dangers. Many commentators believed it increased the possibility that the United States would annex the British West Indian colonies, and with that came the potential imposition of the segregationist race regime of Jim Crow. Now, annexation talk had existed for several decades, and it had taken several forms. During the 1850s, many U.S. Southerners hoped to shore up slavery's existence in the Americas by annexing Cuba to the United States. In the 1880s and the 1890s, as Jamaica continued to struggle economically, there were some Jamaican elites who believed that Britain was abandoning the colony, and who began to wonder whether it might be preferable to be annexed to the United States. There were various points in which there were discussions also about Canada annexing the Caribbean colonies. And this was debated most strongly during World War I as a way of transforming Canada from a dominion, a colony of Britain, into its own imperial nation. And this too went nowhere. From what I can find, although certainly I am always on the lookout for evidence to the contrary, there is little to suggest that the U.S. intended to formally annex Jamaica at this point, in marked contrast to the more detailed but still theoretical plans for Canadian annexation. But even though I don't see any real political plans to do this, the creep of U.S. influence was real, and as a result, many viewed Davis's actions with suspicion. This included people who believed that Davis was there in Jamaica after the earthquake for charitable reasons, but they also understood that once he was there, if he was allowed to stay, all manner of things could happen. As the editors of the Daily Gleaner made clear, we do not like American civilization nor American methods. We object to Great Britain truckling to America and would fight strenuously against the British West Indies becoming American, the very idea of this being preposterous, end quote. Similarly, back in London, officials worried that if they forced Swetnam to resign, that might actually increase the amount of American presence. It would seem that he had been easily tossed aside in order to placate the Americans. Even the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who was friend of one of the senior clerks in the Colonial Office, he described this concern decades later. The trouble in Jamaica, he wrote, was that the Americans had a way of behaving as if the island belonged to the United States. There were some anonymous or pseudonymous contributions to this effect as well. One Swetnam supporter wrote under the initials IW, made the point more strongly in a letter to the editor, and this was published in a different newspaper, the Jamaica Times. He stated, "With the enterprising American, it is not always humanity so much as business. I think our sad calamity and praiseworthy actions of Admiral Davis, through him the American nation, would have afforded a glorious opportunity for American jingoism and brilliant journalism under glaring headlines to proclaim to the world America's wide awakeness and alertness as against England's sleepiness and backwardness in times of emergency in matters affecting Jamaica's interest, and this would keep the sentimentalists alive." IW's arguments reminded readers that the United States was not a neutral country offering a helping hand. The thin end of the wedge, he said, must not be allowed in anywhere. Annexation was foremost a threat because it had the potential to introduce a new and supposedly incompatible system of racial hierarchy, that being Jim Crow, on top of the pre-existing and fragile racial hierarchy in Jamaica. And I should point out that the proposals for Canadian annexation of Caribbean colonies in the 1910s foundered over that perceived incompatibility between the racial assumptions of Canada's own settler colonial project and a very different racial makeup in the Caribbean. And so when people were discussing this, part of what they were doing was really parsing the distinctions that they saw between the two racial systems in place between the British Caribbean and the United States. Head West Indies clerk in the Colonial Office, former acting governor of Jamaica, and Fabian socialist Sidney Olivier had himself engaged in such an enterprise in 1906, when he published a book called White Capital and Colored Labor. And I should point out that the last name there is not a coincidence. This is the uncle of the actor, Laurence Olivier. Primarily about the prospects of long-term imperial expansion and capital investment on the African continent, White Capital relied heavily on comparisons to the Caribbean and especially to Jamaica, which was the island that Olivier knew best. And he believed that the situation in Jamaica provided an opportunity to think about racial theories that were in play. He found it best to examine the operations of race in Jamaica through a different comparison, so not between Jamaica and Africa, but between Jamaica and the southern United States. There was, as he put it, color prejudice in the United States, but it does not appear on the surface, and such as there is unquestionably diminishing. Moreover, he associated these ideas with womanhood, so suggesting that where these ideas were strongest was in the women of Jamaica. While racial prejudice existed in Jamaica, according to Olivier, it did not serve as a barrier to social intermixture, as he put it, or social equality. In the United States, however, Olivier found race relations to be marred by an intense, and this is his word, negrophobia, a belief that the, quote, Negro is an inferior order in nature to the white man in the same sense that the ape may be said to be so. And he argued that this belief, that this fear, in fact, of Black people accounted for the assumptions that were pretty common in the South, that Black Americans were inherently prone to vice and laziness. He associated this belief in the terrorist violence of lynching, and also in U.S. resistance to the kind of social equality that he said he found in the Caribbean. He described Southerners as gripped by an attitude of mind that impressed him as superstitious, if not hysterical. But as much as he decried these Southern beliefs, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree that Southerners were hysterical, and I say that as a Southerner, his descriptions of these supposedly alien beliefs were drenched in anti-Blackness of his own. In an extended section about the relatively low rates of intermarriage in Jamaica, he approved of white women's supposed reluctance to marry Black or mixed-race men. He said, "A woman may be the mother of a limited number of children, and our notion of the number advisable is contracting," he said. "It is bad natural economy, and instinct very potently opposes it to breed backwards from her." And I think that is key. So as he is talking about the hysteria of the Southerners, he is discussing the idea that a white woman who has children with a Black man is breeding backwards from herself. This was a logic that also applied only to women, because in the way that he phrased it, since men had no reproductive limits, there was no need to be so careful about who they were reproducing with. Olivier also believed that it was mixed-race subjects who made Jamaica more stable, more efficient, and gave it more promise than a colony of solely white and Black subjects. But here it doesn't seem to occur to Olivier that actually this is just a matter of how societies are categorizing mixed-race people rather than whether mixed-race people exist. They, of course, existed and have always existed in the U.S. South. So while for Olivier, Black people or people of African descent were not to be feared, and he saw them as members of the human family, he crucially did not see them as equal to whites. He was very comfortable explicating these social and moral hierarchies. For him, these were simply facts, and they were distinctions of human capacity and not race discrimination. And I find it very interesting that he believes that you can make distinctions of human capacity and not be engaging in race discrimination. And there was another important aspect to Olivier's thought. He believed that the U.S. Constitution was to blame for the country's poisoned and violent race relations, but not in the way that historians today would argue. In contrast to the British Empire, where when emancipation happened in the 1830s, enslaved people were freed into subjecthood, mostly without political rights, the U.S. Constitution, by some force, freed enslaved men into full citizenship through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And you see similar dynamics. The details are different, but you see similar dynamics in much of the Americas, usually through gradual emancipation measures. Where there were delays between freedom and citizenship, we are talking a matter of years in the case of independence struggles, so the fights for independence in Spanish America, rather than decades or longer. Olivier saw this as a grave mistake. Freed people could not be ready for citizenship, he said, and their premature receipt of citizenship had exacerbated social tensions, and he argued was responsible for Jim Crow violence. Britain had not made this mistake, he explained, since, quote, "we in England consider an elective civil service an elective judiciary to indicate a mistake in constitution building," end quote. Moreover, British subjects in the Caribbean benefited from what he described as the benevolent despotism of Crown government. And these are his words, benevolent despotism. By freeing adult males into full and equal rights of citizenship, he argued that the U.S. Constitution gave, quote, the colored race a permanent plea of injustice when those rights are abrogated in practice. And then he said that it forced whites to, quote, use violence and constitutionally unjust means to maintain their position, even though he also agreed that their status in the racial hierarchy was the proper place for them to be. So I want to pause here for a little bit because I am fascinated by this set of statements. And although this is not my main project, it is something that I've kept an eye on over the past 15 years or so, just how frequently British society has and continues to use the United States as a distraction from its own poisonous and actually longer history of racism that still has its own present, copious, and violent reverberations. Those of us who were here this summer recall how violent these can be. So I've been paying attention to this for at least 15 years, but this has been of particular significance to me in the last 7, which basically maps onto when I came to this country to work in 2017. I have lived the physical toll that is working as a Black woman in this country's universities. And in my personal experience, which will not necessarily be everybody's experience, in my personal experience, it has been immeasurably worse working here than in the US. The only country where a fellow academic believed that he had the right to demand that I provide identification to prove that I belonged in my office building was here, not there. And given what all else has happened to me in the years after that, that is now a sort of, at the time I was horrified, that is now kind of an amusing anecdote. Over the past few years, I have watched as once again British universities suppress Black studies programs and fire Black professors. There was another round of that this summer. And this has been a consistent pattern in this country that goes back decades. Meanwhile, when I look to the situation in the United States, which is deteriorating, to be clear, I still see Black studies programs that are still managing to grow, even among an extraordinary and very well organized political backlash to them. And I also see Indigenous studies, Latina studies, and Asian American studies programs and departments existing there in a way that I don't think they will ever exist here or their equivalents. I spent 3 years doing as one person in a 2-person team the work that back home an entire department of 10 to 15 people would do. But it's not just current circumstances. This is also something that has shown up consistently in my research. And I see this in a number of places. First, the tendency to celebrate 1807 and the abolition of the slaving trade as a first in the world milestone when New England began a form of gradual emancipation 2 decades earlier. And more importantly, enslavement ended in Saint-Domingue in 1793 during the Haitian Revolution. There is a tendency to elevate 1807 as the end of enslavement itself, when actually enslavement continued to deadly effect in the Caribbean and the Cape Colony for another 30 years. And for the people who lived that 30 years, that is, of course, not a minor period of time. I think there's also a big tendency to ignore the profound violence in the Caribbean in the mid-19th century, because it seemed and still seems, I think, to some people, easier to look to the U.S. than to look to what was happening in the Caribbean. So the dynamics that I have personally experienced, that I think we're seeing in these statements from Olivier, they have 200-year-old roots. And in fact, I think it's really important to emphasize that Britain began to use slavery and enslavement as its specific reason to cast itself as superior to the U.S. decades before Britain stopped enslaving people. So Olivier's musings sit squarely within this tendency, and I think they're very telling. For him, the right approach to emancipation was to deny freed people citizenship rights, because otherwise they could draw on their very citizenship to protest when their rights were abridged. Now, there is an important caveat that I want to make, which is that legally, British people in Britain were not citizens at this point either. They were legally subjects. The right to vote in Britain had long been tied to property ownership. And so it is not that surprising that he is skeptical about citizenship rights as they had developed in the US. And of course, the way that the US thought about citizenship was, of course, very famously in direct opposition to Britain. So the fact that he is not thrilled about the US Constitution in of itself is not that surprising or even all that notable. But Olivier did not confine his argument to citizenship as a concept. He linked it very specifically to what it was appropriate for formerly enslaved Black men to have as free men. The right approach for him was to create a situation in which freed people had never grasped full inclusion into the polity. It was also to create a society that never asked white people to consider themselves legally equal to the people they had previously enslaved and previously described as subhuman. And not only were Olivier's arguments telling, they were indicative. This maneuver of rejecting American racism by elevating Britain's own version of white supremacy and racism as somehow more acceptable would happen time and again in the months after the earthquake. So out of the sort of thicket of commentary about U.S. intentions in 1907 emerged a similar strain of thought that laid out the implications of a potential clash between Black Jamaicans and U.S. Marines on British soil. And I think it's really interesting that in the middle of an earthquake, and those of us who work in disaster studies, the actual findings are that in the immediate aftermath of an earthquake or of a natural disaster, I will sidebar the question of whether a disaster can be natural or not. But in the immediate aftermath, communities generally pull together, and what is often described as violence might be critical resource gathering. So looting is often people getting bread to eat. And this is a pretty steady finding that disaster studies scholars have found. So it is notable that rather than thinking about how people might be trying to secure shelter, if we remember those lions on the racecourse, to gather their sense of self and a sense of safety, that instead these people are imagining some sort of clash between Black Jamaicans and American Marines. It's very telling that that is what they are thinking about. So Swetnam had a similar understanding as Olivier to the differences in racial climate between the U.S. and British territories. In a private dispatch, he explained that he had rejected U.S. help in part because he thought that the Americans' presence and the racial ideologies they brought with them would stir up unnecessary conflict. And in fact, these concerns were so sensitive that this dispatch that he sent them, or that he wrote them in, is actually marked private and secret in the archives. More specifically, he believed that if American Marines and Black soldiers interacted, in particular, if a Black Jamaican officer had to pull rank on an American Marine, that racial tensions could explode. He explained, "The risk of misunderstanding is immensely augmented where different races or mixed races prevail. It is still greater where there is a dominant race in the minority, and in the vast majority, a race which resents the idea of being dominated." And he continued, quote, "The Jamaican Negro is prone to resent the treatment accorded to him by inferior Americans, and inferior Americans often have a very summary way with Negroes," end quote. So as these two statements suggest, Swetnam rejected Jim Crow, but he is also trafficking in his own version of a racial hierarchy. As he describes, Black Jamaicans resented domination, while white Jamaicans were the dominant race in the minority. And even if this particular expression of white supremacy did not involve the quote-unquote summary way that inferior Americans had with Black Jamaicans, it was also rooted in ideas of racial difference. Swetnam even turned to ideas of racial difference that were tied to the climate when he explained why he had refused the American help. He said, quote, "The streets were being very rapidly cleared by large numbers of Negro laborers under the Public Works Department and the mayor and council. The work under a tropical sun was far more congenial to Negroes than to white sailors from northern climates who ought not to be exposed to it." And one wonders if Swetnam had been to the U.S. South, which is just as hot and also tropical. Swetnam, of course, did not acknowledge his own racist thought. So by default, he is presenting racism, American style or otherwise, as an alien and hostile element not to be introduced into the post-emancipation chaos. He described an incident between a naval officer and a group of Black men. And in this incident, the only use made of a revolver, he noted, quote, was on the part of an American naval officer who drew one because when surrounded by some half-dozen black men, he thought they entertained some sinister design against him, a belief I do not share, end quote. He was not the only one to imagine American Marines shooting Jamaicans during their rescue efforts. The editor of the Jamaica Times thought that this kind of confrontation would have been inevitable because Jamaicans were supposedly submissive to their own authorities, but would not be so submissive to Americans. By this logic, the knowledge of Jim Crow would embolden Black Jamaicans, and unlike the British, the Americans would not have understood any subsequent actions. There were versions of this that also reached Westminster, and I find this next set of statements really extraordinary. One MP praised Swetnam for eliminating the possibility of insurrection by turning away the Americans. He suggested that U.S. troops would have overreacted to instances of pillaging by shooting Black culprits. Had American officers, quote, used the rifle, not the whip, the vast colored population might thus have been goaded into violence, which might have developed into insurrection, end quote. But hear that well, because for that MP, the whip would have sufficed. Black and mixed race commentators perceived a very different threat from a Jim Crow-inflected U.S. presence, and what they imagined was a situation in which they would be subject to arbitrary terror and violence. Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay was 17 in 1907, and he was attending a Kingston trade school. When the earthquake hit, he had been in bed reading a Wild West thriller. As he later recounted, our governor's protest created an international incident. The rear admiral said he had been insulted. Washington referred the incident to London, which asked the governor to apologize. The governor said he wouldn't, for he felt he was right, and all the people backed him up. The colored people were very happy indeed to say that Jamaica was not the United States, where colored people were kicked around. For McKay, the Marine landing constituted an invasion, and he was not alone in retrospectively, I should say, understanding the geopolitical landscape. In fact, geographic sort of distance, both in time and space, from the death, chaos, and hardship clarified for many how pernicious the American intervention might have been. For some of those Jamaica Memories essayists who included the earthquake in their recollections, Swetnam's showdown with the Marines stood out. Rupert Henry's submission focused entirely on Swetnam, and I'll read this in what I think is in full. American food ship brought supplies for the stricken people, after which the governor returns it back to the President of America. The American Marines also landed at the prison and took up position. The governor also rejected them, and the President of America sent messages to England about the incident, and he was insulted by the said Governor Swetnam, after which he was called home to England to give his reason. So he went, and they asked him why he insulted the president. He told them he'd done that to save the expenses of the country. He was asked in what way the expenses of the country would come. He told them that America had done the same thing to another country, and after everything was over, she sent indemnity on the country to pay up many thousands of dollars, preventing them from seizing it. So it would be the same trick they would play to Jamaica. England told him to make an apology to the President of America. Instead of doing so, he had resigned from his office and said he would prefer the sword to be broken over his head than to make apology to the President of America. And again, to emphasize, this is 52 years after this event in which Rupert Henry is describing a really detailed and complex, but probably also accurate understanding of the games that the U.S. was playing in the region and the threat that Davis posed. Cecil Levy, who was 10 or 11 and living on the other side of the island in 1907, also remembered Swetnam. In 1907, there was an earthquake, he stated in his entry. The United States of America sent down foodstuff, and the governor returned it. The United States government said he had insulted the government and that he should apologize, but he refused and resigned. Joseph D'Souza had been working on a downtown wharf when the earthquake struck, and he saw Swetnam surveying the damage on King Street that night. It was he who reprimanded the USA admiral who had sent an armed force to quell the prisoners, the elderly man wrote. He also noted that the governor came back to reside in Jamaica for some time after his resignation, and it seems as though for de Souza that was a choice that perhaps indicated Swetnam's attachment and commitment to the island. Notable among all three of these essays, I think, is the absence of rancor or even surprise that Swetnam had refused disaster relief. The intervening years likely made clear that U.S. intervention was never merely a kind gesture. And in fact, both Henry and de Souza's essays paid more attention to the Marines' actions than to the medical supplies, with Henry providing a really clear articulation of how dollar diplomacy might work in Jamaica. More, though, was at stake than sovereignty, as McKay's description had noted. In his account, Black Jamaicans celebrated Swetnam because his rejection of Americans was a rejection of Jim Crow and its potentially deadly consequences for people of African descent. The most extensive articulation of Black fear came from Louis Meikle, a Jamaican-born mixed-race physician who had attended medical school at Howard University in Washington, D.C., before practicing medicine in Trinidad. In 1912, Meikle published a book called The Confederation of the British West Indies versus Annexation to the United States of America. Meikle's argument against annexation was based almost exclusively on race relations. And actually, in fact, he believed that economically, the British Caribbean would probably benefit from a closer relationship to the U.S. But the character of American racism towards Black people and Jews made this a dangerous prospect for Meikle. He found American racism more problematic, though not necessarily more prevalent, than British racism. White Americans believed that Black citizens were a direct threat to their superiority, which he attributed to the fact that white and Black Americans shared a country in a way that most white Britons did not. And in fact, he repeatedly suggests in this book that racial politics in Britain would be more akin to those in the United States if there had been more Black subjects living in the UK. Furthermore, Americans policed racial boundaries more intensively and violently, which would pose a problem for the large class of mixed-race Caribbean people, many of whom conducted their lives in the Caribbean as white men and women. If their islands were annexed to the United States, these men and women would be demoted to Black, by the way of the one-drop rule, and would be subject to more stringent and brutal forms of racial discrimination, including lynching. That said, I think it is actually notable that in this text, he is more concerned about his specific class of economically comfortable and professionally successful mixed-race people than the larger population of Black people in the Caribbean. Within this broader argument, Meikle pointed to the earthquake in particular, and he saw the aftermath as representative of U.S. intentions. When Davis landed his Marines under arms and erected tents upon British soil over which flew the Stars and Stripes, he wrote, "These actions made clear what their purpose is, without exception, as regards the future of these possessions. Jamaica and her sister colonies owe much to ex-Governor Swetnam for the stand that he took on that occasion," Meikle wrote. So he clearly saw Swetnam as preserving both British sovereignty and protecting Black subjects. And furthermore, he argued that Swetnam, quote, demonstrated to the world that there was no such grave peril as seen through American eyes to be feared from the Black people of Jamaica. So common to all of these disparate appraisals was the idea that U.S. segregationist ideologies threatened Jamaican society. What that threat was differed depending on the identity of the commentator. Black Jamaicans were cast alternately as likely aggressors whose latent tendency to violence was being held in check by British rule, or by themselves. Black Jamaicans tend to see themselves as potential victims rather than aggressors. Nevertheless, these depictions seem to share a belief that the only system that was able to manage the region's unique racial climate was the British Empire. But still, given the geopolitics of the moment, managing that internal climate had to coincide with preserving the tentative relationships with the United States. Swetnam's error was in potentially, though actually not all that seriously, threatening the latter. Thank you.